Okay, my name is Brian D'Agostino. This is the session of afternoon plenary on the Friday, May 29, first day of the 2026 IPHA conference. And I'm introducing our plenary speaker, Benjamin Abelow, Dr. Benjamin Abelow. Um, Benjamin Abelow holds a BA in European history from the University of Pennsylvania and an MD from Yale Law School of Medicine. He has presented his conclusions about trauma and religion in peer-reviewed journals and at academic conferences in the United States and Europe. His previous book, How the West Brought War to Ukraine, has been translated into 8 languages and was a bestseller in the United States, Germany, Italy, and England. Dr. Abelow.
Hmm. Uh, Thanks, Brian. Just to be clear, so I have a medical degree from Yale. I don't have a law degree. Not that it's so significant, but uh, so thanks a lot, first of all, to Brian and Ina for helping coordinate this, and to anyone at IPA who was, involved in inviting me. Thank you. So I wanted to start with two kind of procedural items that potentially might be distracting. I'll just flag them, so hopefully they won't be distracting at all. But so I happen to sit on a swivel stool as my desk chair. And sometimes when I'm talking, I inadvertently end up swiveling a little bit back and forth. So I'll try to avoid doing that. But if you see it, that's what it is. And hopefully it won't be an issue. Um, Second is I use a PowerPoint in this, and I use it in a particular way that involves a lot of slides, most of them with just a few words on the slide, and it moves kind of very rapidly. And what I do in most of the slides is I just read them almost verbatim. I've somehow find that that works a little better in terms of reinforcing key ideas, and it avoids a disconnect between the text on the slide and what I'm saying, which I think sometimes, at least for me, can make me feel like I'm having to multitask when I'm on the receiving end of that. So I just want to give you a heads up. If you are listening just on audio and it's convenient for you to watch the video too, the slides, I think, make it easier to follow the audio, just the way I do things. So just wanted to give you all a heads up. And if you miss any fine points, don't worry. I think that the main points will come across well, notwithstanding all the high speed of the presentation. And if anyone really wants to dig deeper at some point, I've got a number of published articles that are available through academia, or I can send them to you by email if you really want to go into something more. So, and these are them. All right, I'm going to start with the first example, which is kind of an introductory example that will help lay the foundation and let me lead in with then describing some of the basic concepts and terminology. And the example will be ancient myths about abandoned children. And here we go. Many myths in the ancient world pertain to figures who were abandoned as children. I'm going to quote now from a book by John Boswell, who's a late Yale historian, wrote a wonderful book called The Kindness of Strangers that covers abandonment in the ancient and medieval worlds. Here's what Boswell has to say about ancient myths of abandonment. This is blocking my screen. Sorry, it is blocking something. Okay, anyway, Oedipus was, I'm sorry, I can't seem to move this. There we go. Okay.
There's nothing blocking that we
Yeah,
can
yeah,
see.
no, it was blocking, and I'm actually reading. So,
Okay.
Oedipus was found by a shepherd and reared by a childless king. The mythical founder of the Ionians, Ion, was abandoned. Cyrus, the founder of the Persian Empire, had been abandoned and brought up by a herdsman and his wife, according to Herodotus. Okay. Uh, as had Paris, who began the Trojan War, which ultimately led to the founding of the dynasty overthrown by the abandoned twins Romulus and Remus. Telephus, the king of Mysia in Greece, and Habus, a ruler of Puentes in Spain, had both been exposed as children, according to children as a child, and his twin sons Zephyrus and Amphion were exposed, as were Poseidon, Asclepius, Hephaestus, Attis, and the goddess Cybele. So the actual reality that was going on in, for example, in ancient Rome at that time, which was the area we know the most about, Boswell estimated that 20 to 40% of all infants in Rome during the first 3 centuries of the Common Era were abandoned. Most of these died, and the survivors were brutally exploited, raised as slaves, child prostitutes, castrated as eunuchs, or raised as gladiators. And abandonment was widespread in much of the ancient world. So the question is, why did these myths become popular? And my suspicion, and Boswell's, and probably everyone here, is that the myths reflected a pervasive social reality, and that they arose in response to that reality, and they entered the cultural mainstream because they made sense in terms of lived experience. Now, interestingly, these myths, many of them have what I term happy endings. The abandoned children typically are rescued and adopted or reclaimed by their original parents, The children often go on to great things, for example, to become a king or national leader. And this is very different, of course, from the historical reality. Not just different, but the reverse, or in fact, the myth seems to undo the trauma, we can say. And this, I think, can provide a motivation for embracing the myth, the sense of the reversal. Not just a distraction from the actual reality, but to the extent the person engages with the myth, can provide a sense of reversal or undoing of the trauma. I term this narrative amelioration or mythic amelioration. There are narrative myths, and then there are salvation myths, and sometimes the salvation myths are ameliorated. So I term those mythic as opposed to narrative amelioration. This has a lot in common with what the child psychiatrist Lenore Tur has termed a post-traumatic compensatory fantasy. And of course, this is also somewhat reminiscent of how Freud spoke of dreams as a disguised fulfillment of a suppressed wish. These are not so disguised, and they're not really suppressed, but there is a sense of which this is dealing with a wish fulfillment, you might say. Okay, some concepts and terminology now that I can build on this. Okay, I refer to endemic or stereotypical childhood traumas. I'm thinking of something like corporal punishment that is very widespread in the culture, so that many children, most or even all virtually, experience something very similar to each other in terms of the trauma. And this is the trauma that affects large numbers of children in the same way. An example would be corporal punishment. So I use the word traumatogenic sometimes. One of the roots of this is gen, which refers to create, cause, or originate, as in the words gene, genital, generate, Book of Genesis. So traumatogenic refers to caused by trauma, or developed in response to trauma, or responding to trauma, or resonant with trauma. And then a traumatogenic myth, of course, is a myth that is caused by trauma, developed historically in response to trauma. It responds psychologically to the trauma, and it's resonant with the trauma on an emotional, even cognitive or behavioral level. Also, just to be clear, I use the myth here in a sort of a neutral, non-offensive, I'm not saying this is garbage. I'm saying it's a myth from a kind of anthropological perspective. And I speak about religions as embodying myths, in which case sometimes I speak about a religious myth. Okay, if a myth originates in trauma, it will tell you this. And it does this. The myth metaphorically portrays the endemic trauma. The myth maps onto the trauma. The myth is a projection of the trauma. And you can visualize this as kind of 2 parallel lines showing that the structure of the trauma parallels the structure of the myth. You can also do this kind of mathematically, so that if the trauma takes the form, let's say a chronological progression from A to B to C to D, the myth will take the form of A prime to B prime to C prime to D prime. So if a myth maps onto a trauma, we can say that the myth and the trauma are isomorphic, having the same form. Iso is like in an isosceles triangle. If you remember that from geometry, that is a triangle with two equal sides. So it's the same. And we can also say that the myth is traumatomorphic, that it has the same form as trauma. Morph, like something morphs in shape or form. Okay, I do not suggest that all religious myths are traumatogenic, but I do suggest that many are, including those most of us know best. Like dreams, myth can symbolically portray waking realities, including traumatic ones, and not all dreams portray such realities, and not all myths do, but some do. There's also various levels of evidential and logical support for the different myths that I'll be discussing here. Some, it's very clear that there's a lot of evidence that they are traumatogenic, and I think it's hard to gainsay. Others, I think, are a little more questionable or arguable. So I just want to be clear about that up front. Okay, starting another example here. This will be the rape of Persephone, which the original text we know about, this was the Homeric hymn to Demeter, not actually by Homer, but it's named that way. This is from the 7th century BCE. BCE, of course, is the same as BC, just the non-theological term. And this is the myth that underlies the Eleusinian mystery religion or Eleusinian mystery cult, which is something equivalent roughly to what we think of as a world religion. It lasted for over 1,000 years and covered a vast swath of land with a lot of popular support. So this is in some ways we can think of as an early predecessor of what we call a world religion. To understand this myth, we need to know about marriage in ancient Greece. So I'll run through some basics here. Marriage in ancient Greece, the fathers arranged marriage of daughters with older men who are often, in fact, the father's brother, that is the girl's uncle. During the wedding ceremony, the girl is transported to the husband's home in a chariot or cart. The bride is fed fruit by the husband, which was understood to bind her in marriage. The wedding night may have involved actual rape. There's one text, albeit a later one, that describes screaming by the bride using that word. And the wife, after the ceremony, is permanently confined to the women's quarters in her new husband's home. This is something that Plato referred to as a submerged and shadowy existence. Okay, finally, the daughter and the mother rarely or never see each other again. This is at least what seemed to have happened with the elite or upper classes. We know much less about the lower classes, but let's just take it as a general pattern. Okay, let's look at the details of the myth of the rape of Persephone as embodied in the Homeric hymn to Demeter. There are the four main players. There's the daughter, who was Persephone, or Kori, which literally means maiden. There's the father, who was Zeus, the father god, or Zeus pater, means father god, which later in Latin became Jupiter, Zeus pater. The mother was Demeter, and the uncle is Hades, who's the brother of Zeus and the god of the underworld. And for those who are not keeping up with all this every day, you may remember that Hades is not only the name of the god, but is also the name of the underworld itself. Okay, what's the storyline of the myth? Zeus and Hades, the father and the brother of the father, plot for Hades, the daughter's uncle, to abduct and marry Persephone, the daughter. Persephone is picking flowers in a field with her friends, and the earth yawns open, and Hades emerges in a chariot, and he drags Persephone screaming into the underworld. And then Hades feeds Persephone pomegranate fruit seeds, making her his wife and lifetime captive. And then Persephone becomes a permanent prisoner of the underworld, never to see her mother again. This is the myth. Then finally, Persephone and Demeter pine terribly for each other, also part of the myth. Okay, let's lay out the actual historical reality and the myth side by side. I'm not going to read through all these again, but you can see the fathers arrange marriage of daughters with older men, not uncommonly his brother. During the wedding ceremony, the girl is transported to the husband's home in a cart or chariot. And then if we lay out the myth, we see the Zeus, the father, and Hades, the brother, arrange for Hades to abduct and marry Persephone, the daughter. Hades emerges in a chariot and drags Persephone into the underworld. She is screaming, etc. So you can see how there's a real point-by-point correspondence between the actual childhood reality, which we might think of as traumatic, um, and the and the myth. Okay, and here's a picture of Persephone pining for her mother Demeter, and she's standing with Hades down in the underworld, as understood by this painter. Now, to finish the story, which I didn't complete, there is a narrative amelioration, which is Demeter forces Zeus, the mother forces the father to change the terms of Persephone's incarceration in Hades, so that she only needs to spend part of the year in Hades, and then she can spend the rest of the year with her mother and her parents in the family. Okay, and now in reality, the mother had no such power. The daughter's transfers to the husband's home was permanent and complete. So here we see the narrative amelioration that kind of parallels that which we saw in the myths of abandonment. Okay, and again, we see the trauma and the myth forming a parallel. We see the trauma, A, B, C, D, the myth, A prime, B prime, C prime, D prime. And then when we build in the narrative amelioration, the D prime changes to an anti-D prime that kind of reverses the myth itself and creates the amelioration of the trauma. Okay, the parallels between the myth of Demeter and Persephone and the actual childhood reality are well recognized by classicist scholars. The myth maps onto the childhood reality, and then, of course, the question is, what is the most likely explanation? The myth is a lightly symbolized projection of the stereotypical childhood pattern onto a theologically imagined cosmos. Now, the narrative foundation, as I mentioned, this is the narrative foundation of the Eleusinian mystery religion. And yeah, okay. Now, there's no evidence that the Greeks themselves understood the projective nature of the myth. There's no evidence that the Greeks realized that their way of treating girls might be psychologically harmful. And we can even say that the myth, quote unquote, gave voice to this widespread but unrecognized trauma. Okay, another example, and here we move into what we speak of more as kind of typical world religions in our present day. I'll start with Christianity and the New Testament. Okay, what is the child rearing context? Very briefly, we have both the Greco-Roman context and the Jewish diasporic and Palestinian context. There's a great deal of overlap between these two, but just to give a sense that both contexts, and there's really some balance between these two that seems to have been involved in the rise of Christianity. Just to give a sense of these, I'll quickly run through a few Greco-Roman and a few Jewish suggestive. Seneca said, children are beaten, quote, so that the pain overcomes their obstinacy. And he also said that the more a father loves his child, the more severely he will punish that child. Quintilian said something very important regarding the possible traumatic impact of these punishments. He said, when children are beaten, he was speaking about school punishments, but of course these apply to other ones. When children are beaten, the pain and fear often have results which it is not pleasant to speak of, and which will later be a source of embarrassment. This is Quintilian gesturing to the idea that these children lose bowel and bladder control sometimes. And key is the word that they often have results. I think this is suggestive of the level of the punishment and the psychological consequences. Augustine said the father who denies discipline is cruel. When a father thrashes his son, he loves him. Now, these took place at different places, different times. I just presented these three in rough chronological order, but they give you a sense of the overall picture within the Roman Empire. Also, in the Roman world, the laws of patria potestas, paternal power, were of central importance. And here's a quote from Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who was a Greek who was living in Rome for 22 years, just before the rise of Christianity. The founder of the Roman constitution gave the father unrestricted power over his sons. He might imprison or beat him, chain him up and send him to work in the country, or even execute him, at least in principle. Moving on to some Jewish material, Proverbs, of course, we all know, he who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him. Probably the 3rd century BCE, maybe. Sirach, or Ben Sira, or the Wisdom of Ben Sira, known within the Christian tradition sometimes as Ecclesiasticus. We have 2 suggestive quotes. This is from the 2nd century BCE, but was popular in both Greek and Hebrew, in both Palestine and the diaspora. He who beats his son will whip him often, beat his sides while he is an infant, lest he be hardened and disobey you. Okay, and then also right in the 1st century itself, during the birth of Christianity, there are kind of equivalent quotes from Philo and Josephus, both of whom in fact advocated death penalty for persistent obedience of older children. Okay, why are children punished? What is the quintessential crime, quote unquote, of childhood? It is disobedience. So the question here is, what is the childhood reality? Children suffer corporally at the hands of their fathers, mothers, and teachers and uncles as well, but fathers are the primary punisher or determine the course of treatment by the children. Children are punished by their fathers for disobedience. Specifically, children are not punished when they're obedient, as a general rule. Okay, what are the players of this myth? We have the son, the child, the father, and children generically. So the son, of course, is Jesus. God is God the Father, or who later became known as God the Father, but is portrayed in the Gospels too as the Father, of course. And then the children are ordinary humans. These are the children of God the Father, and this is very evident within Paul and elsewhere. Okay, here's the storyline of the Christian myth. To summarize briefly, the son suffers according to the will of his father, or at least this is how I distill out some of the key elements. The son suffers according to the will of his father. The father punishes his human children for disobedience, human children being us, for disobedience, Adam's sin. That's the default position for humanity, punishment for disobedience. And the father saves or does not punish when children are obedient, which they attain through the obedience of Christ. That's the salvation structure. Okay, let's lay these side by side. Childhood, same as I did for the Homeric hymn to Demeter. Children suffer according to the will of Father. Children are punished for disobedience. Children are not punished. And the myth itself, the son suffers according to the will of the Father. God's children, humans, are punished for disobedience, etc. So again, we see within the sort of the overarching myths of Christianity, as I discern them at least, we see very close thematic parallels within the actual experiences of children in that context. Okay, what's the most likely explanation for the parallels? As the same as before, the myth is a lightly symbolized projection of the stereotypical childhood pattern onto a theologically imagined cosmos. Christian teachings may seem counterintuitive, mysterious, or even absurd, to use a word attributed to Tertullian and also used by Kierkegaard. But when understood in the context of childhood history, the myths are actually highly intuitive. Okay, question, which of the following slides, this is a way to try to emphasize the similarity between the myth and the childhood reality. Which of the following slides, and I'll show 4, I believe, pertains to ordinary childhood and which pertains to Christian theology? I'm not going to comment, I'll just run through these, form your own view, and then I'll comment briefly after they're done. Okay, so this is in some sense a little of a trick question because these all 4 of these statements apply to both the central themes of the Christian myth and to the experiences of children. And it's the very fact that these propositional statements apply to both contexts equally is what makes the myth, I would assert, so powerfully resonant historically. Okay. how can endemic childhood traumas shape a religious tradition? Because what I'm implying here is that the religion actually arose historically in the first century in response to trauma. So, by what process can these endemic childhood traumas shape a religious tradition during its formative period? And I'll first look at some psychological mechanisms just to run through very quickly. We have normal symbolic capacity, such as those evident in dreams and figures of speech. We have early childhood memories, sometimes called childhood amnesia. There's a theory of autobiographical memory, which presupposes the existence of what's referred to as a cognitive self. So the idea here is that if the child has no I, has no cognitive self during the very earliest periods of punishment, where do these memories go? They're not connected to a sense of self. They can become disconnected and be attributed to other contexts. We also have a statement of emotional transference, experiencing emotions across thematic related contexts. So it transfers from childhood to the religious context. And then there's also can be tied into traumatic dissociation, disrupts the bonds between memory and the original event, and may set things up, in fact, for an emotional transference. So these all overlap, obviously, to some degree, but I want to give some sense of concrete psychological mechanisms. Now, how could these specific psychological mechanisms play out historically to create religious texts and traditions in the ancient context? And these are what I refer to as processes of religious formation. And some of these are oral tradition, which many people at least would assert played a key role in the formation of the Gospels. Then there's revelation experiences, which Paul described and said was the source of most of his ideas. He actually said all of his ideas about Jesus. And then creative literary fabrication by the gospel writers. And as I note here, these processes can readily translate childhood experiences into mythic stories and teachings. They can give concrete expression to these psychological processes that I just laid out a moment ago. Okay, then what's the narrative amelioration or the undoing of the trauma within the Christian myth, as I understand it? We have Jesus was exalted, he was resurrected and ascended, and the horror of the crucifixion was ameliorated. No such undoing of trauma occurred for ordinary children. The ordinary passion of children was unrelieved. Through the belief in union with Christ, ontological merger, participating in his body and life, the believer's participation in the body and life of Christ, Christian believers can imaginatively insert themselves directly into the narrative amelioration. Okay, now here's the two-step sequences, again, as I understand it. Crucifixion, the stereotypical trauma, is projected or mapped onto the blank screen of the universe, and the resurrection ascension, the projected trauma is mythically undone via narrative amelioration. Okay, what are the psychological features of this two-step process? I understand them as follows. One, before the narrative amelioration, engaging with the myth leads the believer to re-experience emotions associated with the childhood trauma. With the narrative amelioration, the believer can emotionally participate in an outcome that was longed for, but never actually occurred in childhood, for most anyway. And three, the happy endings provide a psychological palliative for a believer reared with the trauma. The narrative amelioration functions as a mythic balm for or a psychological distraction from a real trauma. This description helps us make sense of the great sadness that believers may experience when contemplating the crucifixion or participating in the Stations of the Cross. They're re-experiencing aspects of their own childhood and applying their reactions to those things, attributing them into the Christian iconography or concepts. Likewise, it can help us, these ideas can help us make sense of the tremendous joy that Christians may experience on Easter, which is the holiday that directly pertains to the narrative amelioration. Again, a kind of undoing of their own trauma, mythically understood. Okay, a fourth example. Here I'm just going to go quickly through Judaism and Islam. Like Christianity, both Islam and Judaism emerged from highly patriarchal cultures where corporal punishment was the norm. In these cultures, children were punished for disobedience and not punished when they were obedient. Children, as in Christianity, were saved from punishment by obedience. And we can see here the same basic schematics as presented earlier. And we can add in something I didn't include before, is that not just disobedience leads to punishment, but disobedience can lead to a loss of parental affection and love, whereas obedience or non-punish leads to non-punishment and also a gain of parental affection and love. And of course, there are exceptions, but as general rules, these are the case and have been the case historically. Okay, let me just document this very briefly in the Hebrew Bible. I'm going to use this by quoting from one particular scholar just to emphasize the centrality of obedience within the Hebrew scriptures. I'll read this. There is one overall message that dominates throughout the biblical books. Humankind in general, and Israel in particular, are subject to a covenant according to which obedience to divine command, good deeds, will be rewarded, and sin, disobedience, bad deeds, will be punished. The biblical books almost all agree on this picture. This is David C. Kramer, Jewish Theological Seminary professor, from his book, History of the Talmud, where he's laying out the foundational biblical concepts before he gets into the Talmud. By the way, I'll just mention as an aside that Jacob Neusner believed that the entire project of the Mishnah was the undoing of the sin of disobedience in the Genesis story of Adam in the garden. So there are at least some scholars who believe that this same concept of obedience and undoing pertains to the rabbinic period as well, which is the source of all our current forms of Judaism. Okay, the Quran, similarly, in the first surah or chapter, the text says, he's beseeching God, Allah, keep us on the right path, the path of those upon whom thou hast bestowed favors, not the path upon those upon whom thy wrath is brought down. So the basic idea here is that the central theme of the Quran is to avoid punishment by seeking obedience. This is the central theme of the Quran's first surah, and it thematically frames the entire Quran. Okay. Oh, sorry, I seem to have repeated myself. Okay, comparison among the Abrahamic, the three Abrahamic or quote unquote monotheistic religions. Muslims and Jews, at least based on their early texts, canonical texts, seek obedience to God's will primarily through specific actions. The Quran and Torah and their associated legal traditions are intended as practical guides for avoiding God's punishment and retaining God's love. In contrast, Christians seek obedience primarily not by their actions, but metaphysically through belief in and spiritual or ontological union with Jesus. But in all three cases, the objective is the same: to avoid God's punishment and to win God's love through obedience. How did this structure develop historically? I suggest that Judaism emerged as an early expression of the childhood pattern of salvation or redemption through obedience. Christianity and Islam developed as culturally modified variants or even refinements of the same basic pattern. Can note here that in Judaism, typically it's referred to as redemption, not salvation, but they're much similar. One other difference here is that in the Hebrew scriptures, punishment is typically collective punishment of the people Israel, whereas in Christianity and Islam, it is typically individual punishment. But nonetheless, the obedience-disobedience paradigm is essentially the same.
Dr. Abelow, we're at 35 minutes.
Oh, okay. Why don't we stop here? Do I have 1 or 2 minutes more, Brian? I think I have
Yes, 1 or 2 minutes, yes.
a minute and 30 seconds. Let me skip over some of the other stuff, and let me just run through just some things that I consider worth thinking about. Okay. Just rage and violence. I'll just state very briefly something I said in my abstract. I think if children develop rage in response to childhood punishment, but they're not in a position to express it, that may be particularly prone to being transferred over into other contexts. So this may account for the frequent occurrence of violence or rage that we see, at least in some religious contexts. Finally, let me just jump to a few things, food for thought, just to throw it out there. There's the question of whether, what is there a cultural value to having a central myth emerge? Well, actually, you know what? It's going to take too long to go through these. I think I'll just cut it here. I've covered the main points. People, I'm sure, have plenty to say already. So thanks very much for your patience.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay.